Hello there everybody, this is BatL24 and this is part B of my basically part 3 finale reaction. Yeah, we did part A yesterday and I was feeling a lot out of it, but I'm feeling better today, so let's tackle part B. I don't know how long we're going to get through this. I'm going to be totally honest, this is 6 hours, 6.5 hours, only less than an hour and a half in. I don't know how long we're going to go here. I do at least want to get to the intermission today. I know I said that yesterday and that was a fucking lie, but today I want to at least get to the intermission, which is, like, about 2 hours from now. Like, roughly 2 hours from now. So
I'll save that for the more relevant section.
I do want to get to that, so, yeah.
Test even beyond the player's influence.
Yeah.
And being the only human, and being the weirdo younger sibling, and just being generally othered by people in hometown, whether intentionally or otherwise, is a rather strong foundation to build such.
Okay, so we're talking about Deltarune's themes and stuff like that, and honing in on Chris, Susie, and Noelle. About, like, trying to figure out what Deltarune's themes are before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of, like, the 3 things that make a Toby Fox game a Toby Fox game. So we're kind of doing like a mini character analysis of all 3 characters, and it's not like a full character analysis, but you know, it's a mini character analysis trying to figure out the themes of the game here. And what we know of the game so far is that the Light World is basically just the story of Chris, Susie, and Noelle, who are just regular people that day-to-day troubles. Chris has Asriel in college, and they don't really get to talk to them, and they are in their shadow all the time, and they have their own struggles and issues. Noelle's father is in the fucking hospital. We don't know how that happened. And her mom is the mayor and pushes her to do things. And Susie, we have no idea what her home life is like. So it's like, yeah, she's a bully, but why? Like, we don't see her parents, we don't know who her mom is, who her dad is. It's like, what the fuck's going on in her home life? You know? So, I don't know.
Themes of finding autonomy, feeling like your own person, and
but yeah, Molly's saying that Chris is the themes of, like, autonomy and the power of choice. Or like the power to choose stuff. Because Chris is just like, they go one direction, they have the choice to do stuff or to not do stuff, and they choose whatever they want, so.
And having your own agency be respected. You ever notice how a lot of accounts and experiences regarding Chris tend to revolve around what other people think of them, or how other people probably feel for them on their behalf? For instance, Susie projecting onto Chris by mentioning Toriel, or several of the hometown NPCs just talking about what Chris should say.
Or at least they're generally talking to Chris specifically, what? To ask about Asriel rather than Chris themselves. Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that, because you go up to people as Chris, and you talk to the people, and instead of asking about them, they're like, oh, I wonder how Asriel's doing. It's like completely disregarding that Chris is there. It's like, they are there, they are directly in front of you, but you choose to talk about their brother other than themselves? It's kind of weird. It's kind of very, very interesting that all the NPCs that we know of don't refer to Chris directly. They don't refer to them themselves. They only refer to them through other people. That's actually interesting. That's a thinker. That is a thinker. Why is that? Why does every NPC mention Chris through other people? Most of the time it's through Asriel, who we have not seen yet. In fact, we haven't seen a couple people, one of them being, you know, Sansa's brother, Papyrus, which may or may not actually be in the game, or, you know, people are saying that the Papyrus is the knight, which I don't know about that one. I mean, I'll see it when I believe it, but there's a lot of damning evidence there that tends to allude to the fact that Price might be the knight, or at least someone related to the knight, as we don't even get to see him at all, only through Sansa's dialogue, him saying that he has a brother and he would like to meet them, and also the bone trussel happening outside of the house next to Sansa's convenience store, which was a grill beef, but, you know, I think.
Or how other people react to the weird or silly stuff that they do.
Yeah.
You hear an awful lot about how they feel, what they think about something. Which
Yeah.
makes the parts where they do act on their own accord, or say something in a particular way, or even yell their answer depending on what you tell them to say, stand out. Maybe Chris doesn't see that inherently as a bad thing for all we know, but I kind of doubt that. And I doubt that because of their relationship with Susie. They like Susie.
It seems like things are being done very deliberately by Toby Fox. Like, Toby is deliberately doing these things. He's deliberately writing Chris this way. He's deliberately making it so that the NPCs don't refer to them directly, they refer to them through other people. He's the one that's basically calling all the shots, and it's like, he's deliberately writing these characters this way for a reason. And that reason is yet to be seen, because we only have 2 chapters. But I feel like we're gonna get a lot more, like, exposition and stuff about the characters in chapters 3 and 4. Because that's the idea that he's going off of, Toby. He wants to release chapters 3 and 4 at the same time. I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he wants to release chapters 3 and 4 at the same time. Instead of making it the full chapters 3 to 5 package, he instead wants to focus on chapters 3 and 4 first, release those, and then maybe work on chapter 5 as well. Maybe chapters 6 and 7, because we know that there's 2 chapters planned after chapter 5, as stated in the chapter select, which is also very interesting, because we were under the assumption that there's 5 chapters, and then there's a chapter 6 and 7, but there's also placeholder chapters for chapters 0, 8, 9, and 10. Don't really know what those are doing in the files there, but they're unused. I don't know if they're placeholder graphics or what, but it does make things very, very interesting, considering the fact that it is Toby Fox, and we don't know what he is going to do. He could very well spin a chapter 0 on us, all of a sudden after chapter 7, after all chapters are done. After chapter 7, you could say that there's a chapter 0, or there's more chapters going, in which case it would be a very, very, you know? Like, those are my feelings on that. If there's a chapter 8 or a chapter 0, it's gonna be, oh my god. You know? That made no sense, but it made sense to me.
Susie, more than they probably like most people in hometown, even when she fucking hated Chris, according to the newest girl blog post. To
Yeah.
push back on a specific point from the second part, we obviously don't know what Chris said to Susie that made
Yeah.
her change her whole demeanor.
Mhm.
But what we did see of their behavior implies to me that they never...
People are inferring what Chris said to Susie in relations to that fucking, like, line that they said to her. I don't really know. There's a lot of good candidates for what Chris could have said, and I don't think we're ever gonna know what Chris said. I mean, let's be honest. I don't think we're gonna know what they said to Susie, unless Toby touches on it in chapters 3 to 4, or maybe 5, or maybe 6, or maybe 7. There's a lot of potential for this game to go in many different directions. You know? There's a lot of potential for this game to go in, you know, a direction that we don't know. But one thing is for sure. When chapters 3 to 4 come out, I will do a stream where I play through all 4 chapters, just in their entirety. Post-game content and everything. Because I want to exhaust literally everything. So that when chapter 5 does come out, I'm set up for the best possible ending. And then we can do Snowgrave, which has a bunch of scary implications, because if you do Snowgrave, they end chapter 2, Burley's fucking dead, and Noelle is still in the assumption that this is all a dream, but there's one thing. If you take Noelle's bracelet while you are in the dark world and take it to the light world, she gets very, very confused and very, very, you know, scared and nervous about everything there. I wonder what's gonna happen with that.
Never saw her in a bad or fearful light at all. As far as Chris is concerned, her and them are in the same boat relative to Hometown's general opinion of them, even if Susie doesn't see it that way. Personally, whatever it was that Chris may have said in that post, I think that was the moment where Susie realized she wasn't dealing with someone who...
I guess I'm just saying that Chris and Susan may definitely be able to relate to each other. Thanks to them both having experiences with being considered the odd one out or just weird or a delinquent freak, etc. There's something about them being able to potentially share and being in that position socially and bonding over that, even if not explicitly so.
He was afraid of her.
We still have like an hour left of this.
Not just by being nice, but by relating to her. And
talk about Delta's themes.
Like she has something that they don't. That being autonomy. Noelle even says it herself, and this is the point of overlap between Chris and Noelle thematically, in that they both are fond of Susie. I think it's ultimately for the same reason. Chris and Noelle struggle to feel like their own people who can stand on their own 2 feet. Susie, just by fucking existing, doesn't seem to have that struggle at all by comparison. She is unabashedly herself and isn't afraid to break rules.
Yeah, Susie's her own character.
We delve into stuff that's highlighted in later sections, but Susie actively resists the player's influence. She doesn't listen to us most of the time. She doesn't play along like most other characters do, especially when she's more closed off. And for the faults that might have, which I'll touch on when I get to her own themes, it can't be denied that she has that exact autonomy and freedom of choice that Chris struggles to find for themselves. And when going into the Dark World, while to be fair, this quest for autonomy is definitely given a few challenges due to the player having an increased influence on them and what they can do or say in these worlds, especially in the Weird Route, which again I will touch on in a later section, this theme still pops up for Jevil and Swampton specifically, both of which appearing to relate a lot to Chris as a character. Jevil is the lesser example, to be fair. They do relate to Chris in imagery, given their whole vibe of relating to devils and horns and also just being kind of silly all in all. He does raise points about this idea of refusing a game that you're already playing. While his conclusion is to resort to playful nihilism and just going full fuck it, we ball about it, I can see the connections to this theme of choice, questioning how you can even make a meaningful choice when you're already...
Yeah, Sean said that, yeah.
The bigger picture aren't going to be able to just switch rails. It's a grim way to look at it, but it is a take on the idea that I can see applying to Chris. But with Swampton, the connections are absolutely all there. He, possibly much like Chris, centers his entire arc around autonomy. He wants to be big again. He wants to exist as more than just a darkener, possibly even more than as a lightener. He wants to cut the strings and be completely free to do and say whatever he wants, and yet despite all of his efforts and everything Chris does to help, he can't do it. He can't cut the strings. He's always somehow bound by fate itself, by the rules of the world he's in. And there's irony in how he even tries to nab Chris's soul in an attempt to keep cutting strings. Because even if he were to do that, who's to say we wouldn't just be the strings to replace those? For all we know, we'd just be controlling him, and then what? And the fact that Swampton is never able to be more than just a puppet scares Chris. It makes them nervous, it makes them even yell. It's unlike anything else we've seen from them so far in this game. Something about a character that is in a similar struggle to theirs, not being able to conquer it whatsoever, terrifies them, because what does that say about their own struggle to find autonomy and to be free of their own strings? Do they want to be a heart on a chain their whole life? They probably don't, but they're not anywhere closer to being able to avoid that, if Swampton failing told them anything. This is why I think Chris most blatantly deserves to be the vessel of this specific theme, because Noelle's whole arc in Chapter 2 revolves around being her own person and being able to stand up for herself, and the Weird Route ends up being a really fucked up exploration of that flaw being manipulated to a much further extent than even Queen's. Chris is still the protagonist. They have been bestowed with the curse that is being under a higher entity's force at nearly all times, and as far as we know, they do not have a say in the terms of that unless we see otherwise.
Also, just a side note, I wonder if there's going to be a deeper, route in Chapter 3 and 4 than just the Weird Route, or Snowgrave Route, or whatever name it is. I wonder if there's going to be something else. I get that Chapter 2 was the entire thing of, your choices don't matter, but then, oh, look at this, if you go back and kill enemies as Noelle using Ice Shock, you get a different ending. I wonder if that's going to be something in Chapter 3 and 4, where we get to explore a little bit and find that things are not as good as they should be, apart from the weird route, because I think there's a much darker side to Undertale than we're told to believe. Because Toby is being very, very secretive about everything about this game, and even though we're getting dev updates and stuff like that in like news and stuff, I feel like there's something lurking in chapters 3 and 4 that is much darker than the road route that we have not yet explored. And I want to figure out what that is. Like, if there actually is something deeper than the way route itself. Or maybe that's just going more fiction than fiction itself, and you get to hop into another world within the dark world, within the light world, within this program that Gaster has made. Gaster didn't make the light world. Let me be completely clear. Gaster did not make the light world. He simply made the program that allows us to access the light world. It is a game within a game within a game. Because the Dark World is a game within the Light World, which itself is a game within this program. Makes you think.
They are only able to make their own choices in brief windows where they throw the soul out to ensure that the player won't intervene in what they especially want to have occur in the story.
Yeah.
Who is more deserving of the theme of being able to make your own choices than the character who we, whether for good or bad intentions, are overriding all the decision making of in favor of our own? And with that, I feel like I've made my point with Chris rather clear.
Yes.
But before I wrap up for them, I'd like to touch back on something.
Yeah?
I mentioned how we don't really know much about Chris's childhood, especially not before Hometown, but even in their childhood before Death supposedly disappeared. In the Spammed and Sweepstakes Chris Streamer Chris blog post, their behavior in this post stuck out to me a lot. I already did my summary of it in the previous part.
Yes.
Given that this is one of our very few actual peeks into Chris as a character, completely void of our influence, the fact that every time they end up at Noelle's house, it only takes a bit before they suddenly stop, as if they were thinking about something and just autopilot to play the piano for who knows how long, to me at least, really feels like it's trying to hint at something deeper in Chris's past. Beyond that, the newest girl blog post may also have implications about their past, since Susie seems to know something about Chris that she hasn't elaborated much on. I don't believe she actually knew Chris before Hometown, like I may have speculated back in part 2, but this line about her knowing something about Chris having experience with running away also stuck out to me a ton. In fact, I just realized a pretty good reason potentially why Susie might have said that I only realized right after, like, you know, right as I'm recording this. Maybe she mentioned that because maybe that's how Chris got adopted. Like, I know there's like the whole theory about Chris having been in like an orphanage or something, or even Susie also having been there, like before Toriel adopted them or something. But what if maybe, you know, like Chris was taking like a page out of Kara's playbook here, and like maybe they just ran away from the humans at like a really young age or something. That seems like a simple enough explanation, honestly. I don't know like how much that like holds up to scrutiny, but like, you know, that.
Or maybe he was. I am incredibly sorry. Maybe, this is a thought, maybe they were with Death. And when Death... Wow, I'm speaking very, very badly here. My words, bleh. And maybe they were with Death. And when something happened with Death, they ran away. Maybe they ran away because of what happened with Death, and now Death is gone. Something happened with Death. We know that much. Where is Death? Something must have happened with her to make her disappear. Maybe Chris knew and is just not saying anything. Maybe they know what happened to Des. And I know this is like a very, very out there theory. This is a big stretch, but why else would they be running away? Of course they may just be running away from the humans like that, but what if? What if Chris knew what happened to Des because Des and them were together? Like, hanging out. And all of a sudden something happened which wanted them to run away. But then how would Susie know that? Maybe she knows something that Chris doesn't. Maybe Chris knows something that Susie doesn't. We don't fucking know, but I don't know.
That was like a guess that popped up that feels like it makes a lot of sense, weirdly enough. But, moving on. In any case, there's things about their life that not even we know the context of yet.
Yeah.
They have experience with running off on their own. They've done some pretty calculated and sometimes even devious moves when they pull the soul out, whether that be slashing Toriel's tires or plugging the TV in between chapters as if they already were planning on making a Dark World since Chapter 1.
Yeah.
And on top of all of that, there is something that happened that relates to Noelle that they keep finding themselves lost in thought about, which just leads to them playing the piano.
Yes.
Given how much they must have played it too, I'm certain that without the player's influence, they must have some pretty good experience with it. But in any case, something clearly happened in Chris's life that involved Noelle, and perhaps a few other certain characters.
Maybe Des.
The only thing we know of that they definitely don't want to talk about, aside from a possibly overly revealing book that Asriel bought and never returned, is a certain bunker in the forest behind the graveyard that they may have seen the contents of at some point.
Oh!
The piano, to Chris, feels like such a neat piece of symbolism for their theme in general. To me, it's Chris's outlet, their capability to operate on their own and get their feelings across without anything getting in the way of it, or trying to speak for them. But right now, all they can manage is just one forced plink. It's no wonder they're not happy about it. And, as I said before, there is much more to unpack about them in this regard, but because it relates more to the separation between player and protagonist, as well as what is actually diegetic to Deltarune, I'm going to save my thoughts on it for when we get to those sections.
Okay.
So for now, we'll leave them be, and we'll now move on to Susie, who, in my opinion, embodies the themes of compassion. And bonds with others.
Okay.
Susie is, weirdly enough, the most mysterious character of all of these three in regards to her backstory.
She
Even
is.
more than Noelle, who does have a lot of mystery to her in the form of Gaster connections and Des. But the thing with Susie is, we've got nothing on her. We don't know how she arrived in Hometown, since she was once seen as the new girl given the blog posts. We don't know where she might have come from or her upbringing before Hometown, and we don't even know if she has any family in Hometown. And the weirdest part is, that seems to be intentional on Susie's end, given the fact that when Toriel leaves to let Susie call her parents to say she's staying over, she walks up to the phone and then just runs back to the couch, completely avoiding any phone call whatsoever. We get another concerning sign in Hometown as well, since you can learn that Susie is the one drinking all the milk left in the bowl that Alfie's leaves in the alley, who's thinking there's some stray cat going around and drinking it. So, not only does it seem like her parents are just not in the picture whatsoever, but she's been getting her sources of basic needs outdoors? Does she even have a home or a place to go to in Hometown? Currently, we don't know enough about her situation in the light world to really know exactly what's going on or why she's like this about her family and potential home, if any. But given some other clues through her dialogue, it does paint a concerning picture for her home life. For one thing, there's several instances of her joking about stabbing herself, or at least self-harm in general. One time near a fence in the field in Chapter 1, and then another time when she's shown around her room in Castletown during Chapter 2. This is the same point in the game too, where you can check the fridge and she'll get all excited about the crumbs and leftovers and other stuff that I guess she's used to eating, before then going, oh right, and actual food too.
Yeah.
And really, her reaction to having her own room in Chapter 2, in general, I feel honestly explains itself in my opinion. And of course, there's the fact that she ate chalk in Chapter 1, which is a funny bit, but in context with everything else, Susie is clearly not well fed back home. And if that's the case, then some concerning questions end up being asked about what her parents are actually like.
Yeah.
And this is relevant because then it leads into the other big thing about her. She is the new girl, but has also gained a reputation of being a bully, a delinquent. Everyone is scared of her. They gossip about her beating people into a pulp. They feel sorry for Chris when they're chosen to go with Susie to the closet. And she knows this. At the beginning of the game, the way she's introduced is just by suddenly having the door swing open as you see her, her hair covering her eyes and the room falling completely silent. And given her first interaction with Chris in the game, as well as the newest girl blog post, you get a good idea of just what kind of person she is to her peers aside from Noelle. No one seems to think of her as a friend at this point, or at least she certainly doesn't consider anyone else a friend proper. She's aggressive, and she has some specific bone to pick with Chris, especially for whatever reason. It could be explained by just Chris being the only other weird kid. After all, they're the quiet one, they sit near the back of the class, and not to mention, they're the only human. Bullies kind of work like that. They go for the ones that seem like the easiest targets. But when looking at both the blog post and the first scene between her and Chris, you see there's one thing that stays consistent. In both times that she's bullying Chris, she mentions Toriel, Chris's mom. Her being their mom is important to Susie, or at least feels like a point worth mentioning to Chris multiple times. In the blog post, she says how one day Toriel will get sick of them and that someone will have to make them disappear. But then in this scene, she changes her approach slightly to now say that they've got a good mom, but that it would be a shame to make her bury her own child. Whether her change in approach had anything to do with the blog post is up to debate, I'd say. But given that this is a repeated point from her in conjunction with her own situation that she hasn't elaborated on to anyone else, some stuff may start to potentially click together. And here, I'd like to also link to a video by Nighthawk about this exact topic, which goes over Susie's psychology really well, and it opened my eyes to some stuff that I hadn't noticed before myself, which I even took some notes from for the purpose of my own analysis.
Okay.
But it becomes clear that this very well may be her projecting and showing a lot of the hand that was dealt to her in her earlier life. In order to see that, we have to look at how Chris is seen by their peers. Chris is a part of the Dreamer family. They may be the only human, but they are a part of probably one of the most well-respected families in the town. Toriel is a teacher at the school. Asgore, while having been removed from the force, was a part of the law enforcement. Their other kid is off at college, and they were even close with the family of the town's mayor. And even with the current state of the Dreamer family, Chris is still treated pretty well by Toriel, even with whatever flaws she may have in her parenting. She makes pie for them and herself, she's caring of Chris and notices when they're not quite acting like themselves. She's holding their hand when they go to school. And on top of all of that, even though Chris is the quiet kid, and is weird in their own regard, and sleeps through classes and is often late, they still end up getting pretty decent grades. Or at least it's gotta be average enough that no one's really giving them shit about it. Say whatever you want about Toriel, Chris does have a good mom. They have a mom that gives so much time and attention to her child. Now, with that in mind, how do you think the kid who is seen as similarly weird but is struggling to show up to class herself, and is even seen as a bully by her peers and someone to be avoided, feels? How does the kid who has to scrounge around town for food and either can't or simply won't contact her own family, possibly because of the horrible relationship she may have with them, may feel? How do you think Susie is going to feel seeing someone get the attention that, for all we know, she might have never gotten in her most formative years? This is all to say, Susie's character in Deltarune starts as someone with every wall up imaginable. She doesn't show compassion for other people because she was never given that compassion by those most important to her from the start. And now her peers do the same, assuming that she's just dangerous and wants to hurt people for the hell of it. By all accounts, she is the last person that anyone should expect to be the type to connect with anybody. She especially doesn't want that and avoids that whenever she can help it. However, through Chapter 1's course, something happens. Or, well, a lot of things happen, but it ultimately culminates into one thing. To avoid an unnecessarily long plot summary, through her journey into the Dark World in Chapter 1, Susie goes through a long arc of initially not playing along with the Dark World whatsoever.
She does.
To connect with it, and especially refusing to be one of the good guys, given that she already sees herself as a bad person to begin with. It goes as far as needing to warn enemies about her so that she doesn't do damage to them if we're trying to stay on something of a pacifist route. But through this, she begins growing a bond with Lancer as they get closer to the king's castle. A bond that's then strained when Lancer betrays the group and sends them to prison. Susie doesn't know that Lancer was behind this at first, but upon learning this, she echoes a sentiment that I think perfectly encapsulates her state of mind at the beginning of Deltarune. Why would anyone really want to be my friend anyway? Throughout the Dark World in Chapter 1, it becomes clear that she really started to finally open up to someone, even if it was one of the bad guys, so to speak. Those walls that she had been putting up this whole time looked like they were coming down just a bit because she had at least found someone who she could bond with and relate to. And for her to just start doing that, only to learn that Lancer threw her and the others in prison, is a fucking devastating blow to her. Those walls come back up and are higher than ever. But even despite that, and despite the fight that she starts without Chris Arouse even being present, she can't bring herself to kill him. Because, at the end of the day, whether she intended to or not, she bonded with him. And to so quickly go to removing him from her life after just starting to connect with him, it's just too much for both of them. And she eventually hears Lancer out and decides to talk it out with the king, this even resulting in Susie becoming less hostile to Chris and properly joining the party. And poetically, her journey towards becoming a much more compassionate person is kickstarted because of the king fight. As she deals with someone who isn't just a bad person, but doesn't want to change his ways even when shown kindness by others. She not only sees Chris block one of his attacks towards Susie, taking her by surprise, but King even mirrors the exact thing that Susie said to Chris at the beginning of the chapter, about quiet people pissing him off just before Susie stops him for good. I find myself taking more time to go over Chapter 1 specifically because, to me at least, while it does set up each of the main characters effectively, I think it's especially an important chapter for Susie's development as a character. It's to her what I feel Chapter 2 is to Noelle. The king is Susie's equivalent to what the queen was to Noelle. In both cases, we're dealing with an antagonist who takes on some kind of parental role to other characters, and I think the relationship between King and Lancer especially can be reflective of what Susie has been through in her own upbringing, and the end mirroring the beginning is rather strong proof of that. And I touch a lot on this idea of Susie having come from a rough home because I think it's essential to understanding why the theme of compassion and bonding with others fits her more than it fits anyone else in this game. Because our very first impression of her is that this is someone who has no intentions of becoming nicer or opening up or anything of the sort. Susie, as far as we know, has been closed off for her whole life. And so much of the focus on her own personal arc is in finally bringing down those walls that she's put up for so long. Chapter 1's story for her ends by nearly leaving Chris before going back and saying that she wants to go back to the Dark World with them, as we finally see the eyes behind her hair, where they were once completely obscured. Hell, in Chapter 2, most of the time we see her eyes, and they're only obscured notably when she's putting on the bully persona to stand up for Chris being called a weenie at the bunker. She starts the game with the bully persona to stand up for Chris being called a weenie.
I said wimp instead of wee and noticed it well too late into recording the videos, so too bad you get scary TikTok TCS for weenie.
At the bunker. She starts this game having absolutely no intentions of connecting with others, and if anything, pushing other people away further. But now, just a few chapters in, her and Chris now feel like best friends practically, and you can probably see why. I do think these two genuinely understand each other, and I think Chris has always related to her in some way, even when she hated them. But the relationship between Chris and Susie is probably one of the most important parts of this game's story to both characters. But in context with Susie especially, it's one of the first real ways that Susie has been allowed to finally blossom past her aggressive exterior into someone who still cracks jokes and isn't the most mannerly person, but is still someone who cares. And someone who just wants to spend quality time and have fun with people who care about her. For Susie, her arc and personal development reflects one of the most important parts, in my opinion, of interacting with fiction. Being able to connect with people through that fiction and become more compassionate for others as a result of it. Ever since allowing herself to engage with the Dark World, she's only become a more open person because of it. She's friends with Chris and Lancer, she's learning healing magic from Rousey and having her own quality time with him even when Chris isn't with them, and she's becoming closer with Noelle, a dynamic that could become a whole relationship for all we know. And in any case, people like Noelle are now frequently in her thoughts. She is caring for people because of her own experiences in the Dark World and being able to carry those experiences with her into her reality. When you think about how rough Susie must have had it before all of this, it makes so much sense why she especially likes the Dark World so much at this point. They've given her something to be attached to, and something to be happy about that she wasn't able to look for anywhere else. I think more than any other character, she is the
I'm not talking much because I'm just taking this in and stuff,
the Dark World, even with the risks that may come with it. But, of course, even despite all of the good that engaging with them has brought on the grounds of bonding with others, there are potential drawbacks, and there is still plenty of room for her arc to go to many different and more concerning places. There's something I want to touch on here that Spooky Dude touched on in one of his videos, which I'll also link here. And
the main village Veltern.
There is a weird amount of emphasis this game puts on making Susie happy. Rousey especially wants to make sure Susie is happy. No matter what she is doing, he's always thinking, well, as long as she's happy, right?
Yeah, who is Deltarim's main villain?
It makes a lot of sense why this is so important. Currently, Susie is happy. She has made
Yeah.
new friends, she is going on these adventures that let her feel like herself and like she's actually doing something good for once and is being cared for by others. And she is happily a part of the fun gang, no questions asked.
Mm-hmm.
But Chapter 1 gave us a pretty good idea of what Susie is like when she isn't happy. And remember what I said that Chris saw in her that I imagine they admire in particular.
Yeah.
Susie, unlike most characters, is able to break rules and resist influence with ease. And when she isn't happy, she isn't gonna be listening to anyone. And
Yeah.
for the player especially, the game becomes less about what you can do to influence her, and more about how to stay ahead of what she'll do. It becomes more about warning enemies of her attacks, and if nothing else, you're just forced to be dragged into fights that she starts, even if Chris isn't there themselves. Susie has a surprising amount of control over the narrative that she isn't fully aware of, but exercises with no hesitance. And even when she is happy, moments like the Ferris wheel scene in Chapter 2 are demonstrative of that. And I think something to keep in mind about her in her current state is she doesn't seem to be aware of just how deep the fictional nature of Dark Worlds actually goes. She may genuinely think that there is a way to bring Rousey and Lancer to the light world, but what if there isn't? What if she realizes that these adventures, in some capacity, have never fully been real? That they've always been fictional, more or less. Can Susie grapple with the fact that despite all the good that's come from the escapism she's engaged in, that she still needs to bring herself back to reality and that the Dark World can't solve all of her problems? And what about Chris and the player? Susie doesn't even know that the player exists. She just assumes Chris is kind of weird and needs someone to tell them to sit on the couch, but she doesn't know that this whole time someone else has been sitting in their place.
Yeah.
And not everything that they've said may be truly reflective of what Chris really feels as a person. And she has not really been suspicious at all of anything that's been happening in the story. And interestingly, even the one time she genuinely does start to question things after the Svampton neophyte, she's quickly shut down by Rousey and told that it was just a corrupted program. Sometime, I feel she's going to start putting pieces together and realizing that there's something off with all of this. I think that while she is in a good place right now as a character, the way things are headed, and given what Susie is yet to learn, we might see an unhappy Susie again at some point.
Yeah.
Forming good bonds with people, then her resorting to escapism from
Maybe Chapter 3 before we see an angry
growing as a
Susie.
character. And I hope that the focus of the story continues to be on that growth. But when she eventually learns about the player and about the deeper truths behind how Dark Worlds work, can she keep those bonds with Chris and the others? Can she keep herself from having escapism consume her?
Yeah, I wonder if any of the characters are going to find out about the player, because the player is a part of the story. The player is not a self-insert for Chris. I'm gonna make that very, very clear. There are multiple points in the story where the player and Chris are distinctly separate from one another, which means they're separate people. The player and Chris are separate people. And Deltarune and such Undertow fans don't fucking realize that because they can't read. It is right in the game. Can you fucking read the goddamn dialogue in the game that you play? Chris and the player are separate. They are not a self-insert for the player. Snowgrave makes this completely clear. And other points in the game, non-Snowgrave, make it completely clear. It's like, come on. At one point they're gonna realize that Chris is not making these choices for themselves, that there is someone else in making these choices for them. And that's when they realize, wait, are you being controlled by someone? Because this is not like you. You don't act like this. But is someone controlling you? Are they the ones that are making all of these choices that we're seeing? Surely not, right? Surely not. Surely you're not being controlled by someone else. No way. No way. Clueless.
Her entirely? And even so, can she grapple with our existence as the player? Or will our own ability to suspend our disbelief and connect to Deltarune's world prove to be a threat to her? just as interacting with fiction can bring great connection, and overindulgence in it can strain those same connections.
Fiction within fiction.
Unhealthy.
You know?
And I think that's something that Susie's character will eventually focus on and be faced with over the game's course.
Yes.
If she isn't happy and she loses her bonds with others, then the player experience may suffer for it. And the very means to which we are able to be connected to Deltarune will not only be used against us, but threatened. And this is something that I think is supported by how the game explains losing recruits, of all things.
Yeah.
Just one look at how Razai describes this feels reflective of Susie's character to me. From now on, defeating enemies with violence will make them lost. But the bonds you break may make you stronger. And Susie being so closed off, it allows her to be much more resilient to other people's influence and what people say about or to her. But as a result, it requires someone to be more detached from their emotions and furthermore from ever being able to connect to other people. In fact, a lot of this may even echo the whole Judgment Hall sequence from Undertale and love as a stat in general, but it's important to note nonetheless. If Susie getting mad at Lancer caused us to be in a fight where all we could do was just dodge bullets and hope she just stops at some point, imagine what can happen if she's mad at Chris, or even mad at us. And even with that aside, if she can overcome those struggles with the Dark Worlds, there's something to be said about how her getting overly attached to what is this game's fictional world may not be too unlike our own attachment to the Lightners. At the end of her arc, for all we know, she may be capable of turning that struggle back on us to make us question our own attachments to characters like her, and look at how we grow bonds with both other people and fiction through using Deltarune to suspend our disbelief. Or, if you're someone who prefers to break bonds herself, it may make you question not just how much you really see the protagonist as their own character, but what you actually gain out of being connected to a fictional world at all. She is the perfect character for this theme because, like the player, she is being sent on a journey that focuses a lot on interacting with fiction to learn things about oneself that reality would have been too harsh to teach, as well as grow new bonds through that engagement. And I think what makes her so interesting to this game's meta-narrative is that whatever conclusion she ultimately comes to with how she interacts with fiction and how she grows bonds may very well lead to the player being forced to think about it for themselves and how they attach themselves to this game's characters.
Yes.
Yet again, forcing the player to acknowledge their own connection to fiction, as I've shown this game has continued to demonstrate numerous times in this part. But that's about all I can say for Susie. For being the least blatantly tied to Gaster aside from a single fun event and the Ghana Maker, and being also probably the most straightforward in terms of her character arc, I think she has a fascinating role to potentially play in the game's larger narrative. But with that, let's finally move on to our third character of these three, the one who I feel embodies Deltarune's themes of nostalgia and curiosity.
Noelle.
The one and only Noelle.
Oh, there we go. Oh boy, anime Tails doll. What the hell?
Noelle, unlike Susie and Chris, is actually the easiest character I think we have to go over the backstory of, because we have the most actual info about her background and upbringing compared to the other two. We can safely gauge Noelle has been living in hometown for her whole life, not just from the fact that her mom is most likely the fucking mayor, but also given that she has expressed a wanting to experience a place like the cyber world. A place much more busy, much more bright, given how she reflects on Dessa's promise to take her to a place of that sort. Her whole arc in general in this game shows a lot of signs of someone who hasn't exactly seen a world beyond hometown herself. But beyond that, a lot of the traits we can assign to Noelle's backstory tend to overlap with Chris, in that both of them were rather close in their childhood. She and Chris were in that group of 4 besties alongside Dessa and Azriel, and one could assume that a lot of her own childhood may have been spent having various misadventures with them, as the sweepstakes even supports. They were close, probably the closest that friends could be in a place like hometown. Sure, her mom may be tough on her, and she gets scared very easily, whether that be by watching horror movies with her older sister, or even something as trivial as opening the freezer at the store, and it doesn't help that Chris was often aware of that and scaring her seemingly on purpose, pulling all sorts of pranks to make her see FNAF Game Over scream. She had this weird specific fear of Icy especially, which was so bad that there was even a site dedicated to Icy sightings, most of which coming from Noelle, but some even from Des. But even despite that, and despite all of the other scary moments that she had in her past, like that at one time she was crying after exploring the forest behind the graveyard, or finding a door in dragon blazers that no one else has found, if she were to think back on those moments now, she'd probably find those moments nostalgic. In fact, if you were to ask her, she'd likely say that all in all, her childhood seemed fine.
Mm.
At least, until a certain point. We don't know when exactly, but it was early in her life.
Yeah.
Early enough that even hearing the word her sister was named after completely froze her and left her unable to win the spelling bee in her younger school years. At some point, something happened to Des.
Mm-hmm.
She went missing, and no one seems to know where she is, how she went missing, or why she's missing at all. It's been so long since it happened in the game's timeline that it seems like something people have accepted. Not having moved on from it, but not seeing any use in dwelling on the topic.
Yeah.
Everyone but Noelle. Ever since her disappearance, Noelle has been searching for her, seemingly resorting to the most unlikely places to have any leads to find her with, even junk mail. She searched December Holiday on the internet probably more times than she can count, and yet, despite all her searching, nothing.
Mm.
Of course, she did go about her life despite this. She started a glitch hunting blog where she'd recount her experiences with glitches and secrets in the games she's played, and how oddly specific and unique her experiences were with games like Cat Pedders and Dragon Blazers. But she'd also used this blog to go over some more personal experiences and private posts, remembering how Chris would come over to play the piano after being lost in thought for whatever reason and questioning her friendship with them, or gossiping about her totally not crushing on the new mean girl that's in town. But even despite all of these more recent developments, something is still nagging at her. More changes have been taking place, and clearly, it's all still bothering her. Her sister is still missing. Ever since what happened that led to Asgore's removal from the force, and likely the subsequent divorce between him and Torio, the Dreamers and Holidays have only drifted further apart over the years. Her mom seems to be drowning herself in work, and she's afraid to even ask her for something as simple as the key to get through the gate to her house. Her dad is in the hospital for who knows what or how long, and she can't bear the thought of it just being her and Mom.
Yeah.
And now, potentially, Chris is suddenly reaching out to her again, seeming unusually talkative, and she can't help but think that something might be off about them. But she can't tell what. Everything about her current life feels off.
It
Things
does.
are changing, and maybe it's not all bad, but it might get worse for all she knows. And clearly, one could imagine in her current state, especially as she's getting closer to growing up, that given how much her life has changed, and how complicated things are starting to feel, that it's no wonder she looks back on even the scarier parts of her past with a bit of nostalgia. Back when things seemed so much simpler, and when she seemed so much more curious. And it's especially no wonder that she finds so much to enjoy about being in the Dark World. And the one good part about her life right now is the fact that the Dark World is now allowing her to not only be able to stand up for herself more, but also grow closer with her childhood friend that she may have grown apart from for a bit, and even bond more with her crush.
I gotta go pee again. It will only be a little bit. Don't worry. We are back.
even if she may currently still think that the cyber world was just a dream. And
I'm sitting up for a little bit.
about where her character is at, speaking purely through the main narrative. Of course, the weird route does change us.
I don't want to sit for too long. I'm sitting up.
I'd say Chapter 2 resolved her main issue of struggling to stand up for herself and to take control of her life. And the main route does resolve this by having her snap at Queen and finally think about what kind of world she'd rather want to live in. But the weird route, for as fucked up as it is, and for as much as it does manipulate Noelle, does also make her stronger too. Of course, it's as a result.
The weird route does tell us a lot about Noelle. I mean, it's centered around Chris and Noelle, so of course it would be very, very telling that there would be a lot of exposition regarding Noelle in the weird route, because I mean, Chris does manipulate them. Or we do. Chris is not us. I'm not... what? I don't even know what I'm saying, but... we are making Chris do these things, so it's like... you know? We're the ones manipulating Noelle. It's not necessarily Chris, it's Noelle, but we're telling Chris to do it, so she thinks it's Chris.
Players' abuse of their control, but she does still come out of it feeling more like she can take things into her own hands, given how the Weird Rat version of the scene with Rudy goes, with her not wanting to hand over the game to him. But with that aside, looking at how she is acting in the Dark World, it becomes clear how much the theme of nostalgia and curiosity applies to her. Several things in the Dark World make her think back to her youth and to specific memories. They make her think about watching scary movies with Des, that promise that Des made to Noelle about seeing a huge city like the cyber world, and about exploring that forest with Chris and Azriel and Des behind the graveyard. She is unknowingly spelling out the word December. Which I take as the game quite literally spelling something out to us in this scene. I think we should finally touch on now. This is going to be one of a few genuine leaps in my logic. I do not know for certain if this is really the story, but given everything we have seen so far, I have a hunch that Noelle may actually know what happened to Des. Or at least, that Noelle does remember more about that night where she explored behind the graveyard. Because if you've played the weird route, you know she has a habit of blocking out things in her memory. Particularly, certain traumas and memories involving things that I don't think she'd be able to bear being a part of. All she apparently remembered of being behind the graveyard was that she was crying and had Des wipe her tears with Azriel's jacket. She says she never found anything interesting there, but I think there's someone who would know that's not the case. Chris. I don't know about you, but...
I said this earlier. Chris might know what happened to Des. They were there. And I bet your ass that they were there. They were there with Noelle and Des. They know what happened. Which is why they ran away. And Susie said, you have a lot of experience with running away, don't you? And maybe Susie heard something. She doesn't know what it was, but she heard something. She might not even know that was Des, but she heard something that involved Chris running away. Chris knows what happened to Des. And Noelle probably knows a lot more than we think. I fully 100% believe this. Before Molly even explains this, I fully believe this.
But I'm pretty sure they've been in that bunker, judging from what's said about them in relation to it in Chapter 2. Or at least, if they didn't go in there, then they saw whatever may be in it. And I'm willing to bet that the answer to the question of where is Des may not be lying in that bunker solely, but is certainly an idea of where that answer starts. What I'm saying is, I think Des went in there too. And she didn't come back. And maybe Noelle genuinely doesn't know that that's the case, but someone else might know.
Chris.
No fault of their own.
Chris.
And maybe they're afraid to really go in there and check for themselves.
Chris.
But if I'm right about what happened to Des exactly, then it would make Noelle's nostalgia all the more important to how this story might unfold.
Mm-hmm.
As I've implied and assumed before in this series, I may as well just say this now for the purpose of this series and my interpretation of how the rest of the game may go. I think it's safe to say that the character who speaks in the unused script is Des. For one thing, I have no other candidate who could fit aside from some unnamed character that we haven't met yet. And it being the latter one is a possibility, but a cheap one at that, in my opinion. I'd rather...
And I wonder if we're gonna have any more unused dialogue like this in later chapters. If Toby's just gonna keep adding dialogue for this unknown character that we don't know. Maybe Des, maybe someone else. But if we get some more dialogue between four, then we'll have a better understanding of who this could potentially be. But the theory of this unknown character being Des is an interesting one. It would make sense if it was Des, and it would make sense if Des was in that bunker, because, you know, that character is saying, please someone find me, no one has found me, you know, am I stuck here forever, stuff like that. Which would make sense if Des was in the bunker, because she wants someone to find her, but no one finds her, she's stuck in that bunker.
Work with what we know. But for another thing, there is a certain salesman that has what is very likely the character from that script speak through him, even for a moment.
Yes.
It would only make sense that Spampton, the character who has a specific connection and fondness for Noelle for reading all of his emails, who even used her own searches for Des as a way of drawing her in, would have her own sister speak through him to try to get through to anyone. It not only makes the most sense to me, but it would be tragically ironic in a way.
Yeah.
I have my own ideas of how Des exactly ended up in her situation, but to save my real full vision for later, let's just say that we're assuming Des went missing by going to the bunker, and that her going in there led to her being sent to a place that's darker than dark.
Yeah.
Or even sent to a place between worlds, the same place that the program was made in. Given that this situation inherently is going to tie her to not only Spampton, but to Gaster, and given the already clearly present connections to Gaster that Noelle has, and the stuff that already suggests that Des is also connected to Gaster not just through unused, but even stuff as specific as the use of certain motifs in
flashback exit. Yeah, flashback exit is an interesting one. Because when you hear a flashback exit in post-Snowgrave, like one in the town when Noelle's in the hospital talking about how Chris is not what they seem they are, and Chris is not acting like themselves. Which leads me to believe that we're gonna have a fuller flashback audio file. Maybe when we find Des, and that scares me. For many reasons.
Well, I'd like to echo Andrew Cunningham's sentiment in his video about Gaster's motif, that I believe Noelle's search for Des, and her interest in glitches and secrets, and her eventual confrontation with the character who is best...
I love that Andrew Cunningham video, by the way.
Secrets may end up
that video is so cool.
One. Her nostalgia in both traumatic events and in relation to her days of glitch hunting allows this specific theme of Deltarune that I believe she embodies to take on a much more interesting angle. One that, yet again, proves itself to reflect on the player and how they are interacting with Deltarune. In making Des pretty much stuck in the program in a way, it fully ties her and Noelle's search for her with the concept alone of glitch hunting, or at least looking deep for secrets in fiction. As I mentioned before, secrets are tied with this game's core theme of escapism. Deltarune is chock full of them, and a lot of how I believe the player is meant to experience the game involves being drawn deeper into exploring it, and encouraging the player to be more curious, to keep trying things to find new stuff in it, to make them think, no, surely there's more, I just haven't looked hard enough. And the thing is, Noelle, in that regard, is very similar to us. In fact, even more so. There's already the fact that Noelle has a specific connection with Spampton, which is shown in multiple blog posts and several instances in Chapter 2. She's willing to take risks and try anything to find an answer to something, no matter how unlikely. The Blue Circle post being an example where she took this random string that she could have just completely ignored, but just happened to decide to plug into cat petters and got a mod out of it. Furthermore, Spamton is even an enabler of the weird route. He almost acts as a guide for her to continue getting stronger and to lead her further down a path completely unlike the main one.
Yeah.
Not only that, but going back to cat petters, Noelle also has ties to the man behind the tree. Because of the special egg she got in cat petters that left home due to happiness, that she can't remember the name of no matter how hard she tries. And in the Ice Palace post especially, this curiosity is shown because it results in her finding a door in the game that no one else has ever been able to find, that doesn't even have a key to it. Her ability to dig deeper into something for secrets is so strong that not even she is entirely certain how she manages to find something so obscure. But similar to that, she has an ability for not giving up on her search for Des.
Yes.
Even after all these years. In both cases, she is deathly curious, whether that be out of interest or concern or both. And I think that the fact Noelle is drawn to things related to Gaster, similarly to how the player would be drawn to Gaster if they are aware of him, makes this such a fascinating aspect of the message Deltarune could be getting across, especially when you think about something as under wraps as the weird route.
Yeah.
Barring that route, of course, Noelle is currently in a decent place as a character, generally. She has grown some new bonds, and she's learning to stand up for herself more one way or the other. But there are still things that might make her situation much more stressful. Rudy is still in the hospital, and Noelle might have life hit her a lot harder very soon.
Yeah.
And right now, Noelle is already very prone to nostalgia and looking back on simpler times a bit too much, to where it makes perfect sense why she questions if being in the dark world is even such a bad thing. And again, in the context of the weird route, this is very different, as the arc becomes less about her escapism through dark worlds, but her curiosity is entertained in a completely different way, as it leads to her catching on to how unlike themselves Chris has been acting, and realizing there's some voice she's hearing that is definitely not Chris's, becoming more aware of the player's influence. But again, that aside, something that sticks out to me is how she's not only nostalgic for her youth in general, but nostalgic for specifically her days in glitch hunting, as some dialogue from her implies. And on top of that, she's nostalgic for things that scared her, for things that may have even traumatized her, but she still finds comfort in somehow. And I think that her nostalgia for it can be parallel to a very specific niche of nostalgia for some people. Not just people who miss finding secrets in games, but people who miss playground rumors and that time when finding secrets in general was more like a myth. Something to really hunt for and speculate about, rather than something with an element of finality to it. And I think Deltarune feeds a lot on that nostalgia and is using the idea of hunting for secrets to fuel that. So much of Deltarune to me is about finding secrets to begin with. A lot of the deeper lore you learn, especially in relation to Gaster, comes from fighting the secret bosses.
Yes.
One of the most mysterious parts of the game involves having to walk between rooms as if you're trying to do some kind of fucking wrong warp to shave off a few seconds from your personal best time. And the entire secret
Wait!
The deeper lore you learn, especially in relation to Gaster, comes from fighting the secret bosses. One of the most mysterious parts of the game involves having to walk between rooms as if you're trying to do some kind of fucking wrong warp to shave off a few seconds from your personal best time, and an entire...
The Shay mention, I love that. Shay's awesome, I love them. They're cool.
...is found by exploiting a loophole related to a
They are really cool.
ignorance to how the dark world really works.
They're a good Deltarune Undertale speedrunner.
Tale, as I mentioned before, is how it wasn't promoted pretty much anywhere. People had to find it themselves and spread the word to the fandom's initial denial of it. If the unused script was the game using data mining as part of the larger meta-narrative, the weird route is Deltarune and Toby himself using the art of playground rumors to further the game's message and reflect Noelle's own struggles onto the player. Even the store page adding a fucking ellipses and question mark to the only one ending selling point is a part of that in my opinion. Sure, nowadays, everything about a game you can probably find if you dig through the code or watch a video from someone going over every little detail to prove that something does or doesn't exist. But there was a time when that just wasn't the case. There was a time when people were more likely to just spread rumors, when myths in games were more common, when shit like the Tales Doll curse and creepypasta culture in general was more popular, and maybe kids like me really thought their game could potentially turn super fucked up and evil. It was a lot more about just throwing what-ifs around rather than wanting to be completely right and wanting to solve something. What could be rather than what will be. Something that I think Noelle could relate to a lot. Sure, not knowing everything about something can be scary, In fact, not remembering whole details about stuff can be scary, but
Yeah.
if you remember at least feeling comforted and you feel nostalgic for it, is it really such a bad thing? Don't you miss exploring and finding things you maybe weren't supposed to see, even if it scared you sometimes?
Mm-hmm.
Don't you miss when things were simpler? When you didn't have to feel like you knew exactly how things are about to go and that you couldn't actually do anything to help change that on a whim? When you at least could say that surely you just haven't looked hard enough for the answer instead of taking in some harsh reality? It's fucked up to say, but
Yeah.
it especially makes Noelle a perfect candidate to go through what she experiences in the weird route. Here is a character who has a sizable chunk of her interests and experiences come from her nostalgia for and interest in glitch hunting and video games, being influenced by someone who is participating in a very similar activity by using something that feels like it's breaking the very fabric of what the player is allowed to do in the game.
Yeah.
And the fact that so many of Deltarune's secrets and things we're not supposed to see are tied to Gaster, and thus to the unused script, I feel makes this a case where your own personal search for more secrets may very well double as a search for deaths.
Yeah.
Just like Noelle, your own curiosity and nostalgia for finding secrets in games is an instrument that Deltarune is using to make you dig deeper into it, towards what I think is the game's real end goal above all else.
Death.
To find her.
Find her at OGG. The file that.
Where Noelle's character may be headed in the future of his story, especially because depending on what route you do, there is a chance it could go in two completely different directions. So with her, it feels like I'm trying to predict the trajectory of two character arcs and not just one.
Yeah.
But if I can say anything with confidence for where she may be headed, I think she is the most prone to taking that sort of escapism well beyond anything healthy. The Weird Route already shows this, but as a result of abusing our power over Chris, and thus Noelle as a result. Albeit, it's led to her now becoming suspicious of Chris and aware of the player's existence to some capacity, playing into her search for eldritch knowledge in a whole other way. But even without that, the way things are going right now, Noelle's search for deaths, whether that be done through the Weird Route or main route or otherwise, is a perfect reflection to me of what I think Deltarune especially wants to evoke in the player. A sense that there is always something more to find at the bottom of the well, even if you've checked several times before. Finding deaths is just as important to Noelle as finding another ending to the game with supposedly only one of them is important to the player. As far as we know, getting an answer to that seems impossible.
Yeah.
But something is telling us that surely that still can't be everything that there is to see, that we just haven't looked hard enough. And I think that through that search, both the player and Noelle will have to similarly confront something that has been drawing them in, and
The
has
bunker.
also been looking for them for a very long time.
The bunker.
Whether or not they actually know it yet. And especially because
I want to see that
the
fucking
music
bunker.
program, which exists seemingly on the same layer as the unused script, even that nostalgia and curiosity is an important part of what I think will make Deltarune's meta-narrative work so well. Aside from suspension of disbelief and immersion, curiosity is pretty much pouring gasoline over that fire. In being nostalgic as well as curious, you only become further drawn in and more invested in the game, and thus become more attached to it. If Susie, by comparison, was meant to make you question how you attach yourself to fiction, Noelle is meant to keep you on track and tell you that there is a very important reason to keep digging deeper into this fictional world. That even if you acknowledge this as fiction, and even if the odds seem to be against what you hope to find actually being found, when exactly has that ever stopped you from wanting to keep looking anyway?
Ooh. Wait, what?
You from wanting to keep looking.
Strings. Prototype array arguments. Greetings, Demon A. You've made yourself completely clear. What is this? I've never seen this file at all. What the fuck? This is like the unused script, except it's in the strings.txt. Put prototype, array, arguments, daemon A, daemon B, daemon... What?
Anyway.
What the fuck?
And with that, I I think we've finally done a thorough enough analysis of these three characters in relation to the larger core theme of Deltarune. To recap, Deltarune's meta-narrative and themes all orbit around a spiderweb of ideas relating to escapism and dreams. From fiction, to darkness, to secrets, to even the ocean. It works in tandem with how I believe the meta-narrative is structured, as I assume Deltarune aims to focus on deconstructing the idea of how people escape to and interact with fiction, through manifesting their suspension of disbelief as a tangible object in the game's story, as a diegetic connection to the narrative. Furthermore, Chris, Susie, and Noelle all encapsulate three incredibly important applications of escapism. Chris, obviously, being the protagonist and focusing a lot on how a player may project onto them at the expense of the protagonist's agency. Susie potentially being a way for the player to question how they attach themselves to fictional characters, and the connections that they may gain or lose through that attachment. And Noelle being a reflection and an encouragement for the player's curiosity, and perhaps even nostalgia for what could be, to draw them further into the more offbeat parts of Deltarune's larger story and make that immersion even stronger, despite acknowledging its fictional nature. All three characters have their own unique backgrounds that have led to them resorting to escapism, and the character that made this connection happen in the first place for us takes a great interest in each of them, especially given how the sister of one of those characters may currently be stuck in a place between worlds, alongside the program that allows us a connection to Deltarune. With all of this in mind, I think it's now clear how we can connect everything relating to Deltarune's meta-narrative to the game's themes. In fact, as I've been analyzing them, I've been doing just that when necessary to. This is all to say, I think after finally doing all of this painstaking work to overanalyze the shit out of these characters and themes, we have enough of a foundation to start actually applying the other unofficial essentials of Toby Fox's meta-narrative to Deltarune.
Okay.
Gone over the what
Let's go.
and the why. So, from here, let's finally pick this meta-narrative apart and get as best of an idea as we possibly can into what Deltarune is really trying to say.
Flashing lights warning!
Starting with the first essential.
The
There are at
diegesis.
least one or a few mechanics in the game that are diegetic to it.
Okay, so now we go over the diegetic elements of the game.
Of course, to begin identifying the diegetic mechanics of Deltarune, there are a lot of places we could start. Throughout my analysis of this game so far, I've managed to scoop out a lot of different elements of the game that could be considered as such. Before I get into that, I'd like to just define what diegetic really means in the context of this video especially. Generally, for something to be diegetic in a piece of media means that said thing exists not only as part of the experience for the player, but also exists in the actual world of the media itself.
It's a part of the story.
An example of this would be, say, a song in a video game. Most of the time, music in games or media in general is used for the player's experience, but if a song in a game is diegetic, then it not only is playing in that part of the game as if it's from the OST.
The song playing here, however, is memory, which is being acknowledged by the game and by Undyne as music as coming from the statue in this room. Therefore, this music is diegetic. It was the same thing with Asriel's fight. Hold on. His theme from the OST is playing in this part of the battle. It's probably not literal playing as this is happening with the characters, but it's there with the player to be completely emotionally wrecked by this moment. However, it's not diegetic. Okay,
Is used
so
for the player's experience.
his theme's not diegetic, but memory is. Because it's part of the game.
As if it's from the OST, but is also a part of that section in the actual setting.
Yeah.
There's a difference between being in a nightclub area and having a song from the OST to reinforce the fact that you're in a nightclub.
Hit the
versus
floor.
having the song actually be played by a DJ in that
Yeah,
nightclub.
by DJ.
For Deltarune, to be much more general, we are identifying things that not only exist to serve or
Find every mechanic in Deltarune that appears to be not only for the player's convenience or experience of the game, but is also able to be acknowledged by and directly impacts the game's settings of the character. So it's a game mechanic that's not only like for the player's experience, it's also a part of the story directly.
Convenience the player, but also have a genuine impact on the game's story in some way or another. Things in the game that leave a real mark on it beyond just doing something neat for the player's sake. Beyond that, we may touch on a few things in this section that are just kinda cool and meta for the hell of it, and maybe stretch the definition a little thin, but I think everything counts in order to get as accurate of a picture as we can for what really matters in terms of mechanics that directly impact Deltarune's story and meta-narrative.
Okay.
So, I think to start going into this, because I've already mentioned this being diegetic in the previous sections, one such mechanic that I could describe as being diegetic has to be your own suspension of disbelief and ability to attach yourself to a piece of fiction. To me, it's sort of the equivalent of how Undertale had fading emotional investment as a diegetic mechanic, taking a broader concept involving video games and fiction and making that an actual part of the game's story and message. In Deltarune, as I mentioned already, your own suspension of disbelief is being used to form a tangible, in-universe connection to Deltarune's world, at least under the device theory's logic. I think this is a fitting point to start with, because this connection is the biggest factor that would be justifying the player's existence in the game. As I've shown in the past few sections, this game's core theme is about interacting with fiction, so it would only make sense to have that concept alone be made into a proper mechanic that impacts the game and story. But that isn't quite all there is to this idea. I've gone over how suspension of disbelief is diegetic to this game, but that specifically involves a general interaction with fiction. And not only that, but the question obviously ends up being raised of how far this mechanic can really go, as well as if it really even applies to all forms of interacting with fiction. Suspension of disbelief is mostly relevant to a piece of media that you learned of, something that was given to you or that you came across. So, what about a piece of fiction that you made? Well, it's here that I remembered an old friend. One that I forgot to actually bring up in the previous parts, but an old friend that deserves a solid mention in regards to what is diegetic to Deltarune.
Okay. Determination.
Now, look, I'm not about to go on a whole other tangent about this. I'm assuming you are about as, if not even more brain-rotten than I am after watching this. So knowing determination is about the Undertale Deltarune equivalent to knowing your fucking 10 commandments.
Yes.
Also, while it does seem to have different purposes between games, as we know it doesn't seem to be responsible for saving and loading in Deltarune compared to Undertale, we're not talking about Undertale, so we don't need to worry about that. All we really know about Determination's role in Deltarune is that it's the thing that allows a Lightner to create a dark world if enough happens to be built up and used by one. Or, if you're a real cunning stan, where it once was what made saving and loading diegetic, it is now what makes the act of creating fiction diegetic. I probably speak for not just myself, but several
everything
other
about
players
Determination.
say that Andrew's video on this certainly opened my eyes quite a lot to what the fuck this game is actually trying to get at potentially. But one thing always had stuck out to me when I first thought of this interpretation. Saving and loading is a much more direct mechanic compared to creating fiction. You can't really create fiction through a button press like you could save and load in Undertale. So how exactly does making fiction as a gameplay mechanic manifest in Deltarune? Using the device theory, I think I got the closest answer I could get to this at the moment. By having your own suspension of disbelief, your ability to attach yourself to fiction be diegetic, it ends up serving the same role in my opinion. It justifies your existence and persistence in the game's world, and if Determination can do that, even if not necessarily by the same means, then it's still doing its core job, I'd say, of literally being an act of determination, not being terminated by the game. And for the Lightners, while Determination's main function is to just create fountains so far, rather than connections, you can still consider this to be how their suspension of disbelief is made into a tangible force. Their willingness to make a fictional world a real one to some extent is manifested by stabbing into the nearest gas pipe. And as I touched on already, there seems to be a common theme of the Lightners being a sort of reflection of how the player engages with fiction, as the dark worlds are to them what the light world is to the player. This is all to say, Determination, in my opinion, seems to further support the idea of suspension of disbelief being diegetic, because aside from the creation of fountains being effectively a metaphor for just opening an exe file, I believe it also serves as a way to further the already existing connection and suspension of disbelief on the player's end. And if I'm right about the idea that we may end up seeing a darker world sometime in the future, if that's what the chair page implies, then it would especially make this interesting. Because, again, why wouldn't the natural conclusion to making your connection a diegetic mechanic be to send it to its absolute limits? So, that's already established, and I think it's important because there's a good chance we'll be referring back to this in the rest of what I'll talk about in this section. With that in mind, let's move on to the next mechanic that I consider to be diegetic to Deltarune.
The menus.
The menus.
The program.
So, I've touched on this quite a lot already.
We already know about this kind of stuff with, like, all the things being denoted as program and all being in caps, which is, like, the save screen, the opening, the chapter select, everything that is not part of the actual game, like the light world mechanics, and more outside of that stuff before we even get into the chapter, like, all of that stuff, like, all of those menus and stuff, are diegetic. They serve a purpose aside from just being there to enhance the player's experience.
Parts. Given a lot of factors involving the way that the menus were designed, structured, and even coded and file named, there is a very strong suggestion to me that the menu serves some purpose to the meta-narrative.
Yeah.
One that I've already discussed, in the form of it being a means to force the player to confront the fact that they are indeed engaging with and connecting.
The program's the launcher.
But let's try to get into the specifics, starting with everything that I consider to be in the program layer. Obviously, to start, we have the chapter select.
Yes.
Currently, this is what the game launches with immediately, and with what we know of it also intending to function as its own launcher app in future releases of Deltarune, and the fact that the game's files are structured in such a way that it loads only certain groups of assets based on the chapter you pick, and the fact that you don't even see so much as an intro cutscene affirming that this is indeed Deltarune until you select the chapter, I've always taken this screen to be something of an operating system for Deltarune. It literally will be a launcher in the future from what we know, and each chapter even has some slight differences in how they function fundamentally and have been programmed to operate in their own self-contained bubbles. Whether that be for optimization purposes or otherwise, I think this is still incredibly notable, and for reasons that I'll get into in just a bit, as it makes the stuff that stays consistent, or even is transferred between chapters, stand out significantly. Moving on from there, we then get to the save menu, more particularly the one that you get before having completed Chapter 1, which is our first look at the more bare-bones and OS sort of vibe that these menus give off. I've already gone in depth about this menu too, from how everything is changed to fit more Gastery language, including him narrating over everything you decide to do, both general stuff and also super specific shit that especially makes this menu stand out. For one thing, there's the threat level, which produces the very interesting quote upon getting to the file deletion prompt 10 times and then backing out after that. And we also have preparations are complete, which displays after copying the contents of one save slot to every other one. This menu alone feels like strong evidence of these menus being diegetic, because the fact that Gaster himself is commenting on such specific shit like this is very telling of the nature of what you're playing with. This executable, this program, is Gaster's creation after all, and if it is a tangible object in this story, of course he'd give more specific insight here and there about how you go about using it. But the latter quote especially feels important to this, as it plays into some more shenanigans involving the save files that, again, I'll touch on in just a bit, but keep it in mind. Him acknowledging the idea alone of copying one slot to the others and considering it as a preparation could be very telling of how we might want to go about using this menu in the future. Also, yes, I know that the threat thing is very probably a reference to a near identical Easter egg in Super Mario RPG that also happens if you say no 10 times in the save menu, and it feels like a very Toby thing to make a reference to that of all things, but I still think it carries a bit of weight here even with that in mind. Moving on, we also have the Goner Maker and even Game Over menus, which both serve their own roles in regards to your connection to Deltarune. The Goner Maker is what sparks that connection and is what initially boots up the program for you, while the Game Over screen is what's responsible for reconnecting you to the game's world if you fail to progress the game's plot for whatever reason. It's safe to say that given the Goner Maker exists in a way that identifies more with these menus and isn't presented this way in the core game whatsoever, that it does exist on a completely different layer to everything else, as I've mentioned already. But the Game Over screen is an interesting case because, through the device theory, it may even give a reason for why you're able to give up in Deltarune, unlike Undertale not giving you that option. This one is a bit of a stretch, but it's an idea I'd like to pose in regards to...
And it also plays Darkness Falls.
If going with the mentality that your suspension of disbelief is diegetic to Deltarune and is thus essential to your existence in the game's world, then this would make giving up in the Game Over screen an actually very reasonable option. Think about it this way. In most games, if you do get a game over, you usually do get an option to just quit the game or go back to the menu. In a meta sense, this is you deciding to cut off that suspension and go back to reality to do something else. Using this logic, I believe this may actually even further reinforce the idea of your suspension of disbelief being diegetic, because it's Deltarune's way of handling the idea of the player cutting off their own connection to Deltarune. If quitting at the Game Over screen is you cutting off that suspension of disbelief, that connection...
then the world was covered in darkness.
...would do something like covering the world in darkness. especially when your presence is stated to be the thing that contains the fate of the world and is responsible for pushing the story forward and getting the game's characters further along its plot beats, then of course giving up on your attachment to Deltarin's world would yield such a result. The future is in your hands, as Gaster puts it, and we know that we play a part in creating that new future. And in refusing to play a part in it, it ends up affecting the game's world severely by throwing away the future of it altogether. And once again, as I will get to soon, there is plenty of reason to see why the player even has this much power over that future, and why this connection is so important to not just the player's existence, but the fate of the world in general.
It's interesting that saying no on this makes a black screen and then plays Darkness Falls. It's the only part of the game where we hear that. Aside from, the OST, but in the game, the only spot that you hear that song is when you press no before, beating Deltarune. Pre-beating Chapter 1, pre-Chapter 1 completion. Why? Why is it that only spot where it plays? I think the name of the song has something to do with it. Because now the world's covered with darkness, and Darkness Falls is the name of the song that plays. As I think it further enhances the fact that you saying no propels the world into darkness, because your soul is what contains today's world. And if you just say, no, I will not persist, then the world is gone and thrown into darkness. The darkness falls over the world when you press no. This is the only time that this song appears pre-Chapter 1 completion. You don't hear it. You hear it, if you say no, right? In any spot. But it's this part of the game where it's interesting.
The game over screen being a part of the tangible connection between the player and Deltarune is just one of many ways that the game manifests this. And with all that said, that's about the gist for the menus themselves. We obviously have to mention the fact that these are all the only occasions so far in which Gaster directly speaks to the player, which is notable. Again, I believe this adds credit to the menus being diegetic, as if the program exists tangibly on the same layer as him, then of course we'd have to answer to him if we ever end up in this space between worlds, as I've been calling it.
Phantasm Angel Knight.
The fact that he is the one behind the program's creation. Which brings us to the next piece of evidence that proves this is his creation. The all-caps files. As I've shown already, all of these files, aside from friend and unused, pertain specifically to just the aforementioned menus, and are structured and file named completely differently from the core game. And to further prove this, when looking at the rollout for the 2018 Survey Program demo, it lines up a lot more with the way that the all-caps files were named. And on top of that, Survey Program is even under the version number 0.6.6.6. And given that it was packaged even as an installer, the terms and conditions for it even say that you accept everything that will happen from now on. All of these factors in mind, as well as the fact that Gaster himself is the one that provided both demos of Deltarune to us so far, and the fact that the all-caps files all likely take place on the same layer of fiction as him, above the light world but beneath reality, is more than enough proof to me that we are supposed to see the actual executable of Deltarune as Gaster's own creation. If the game has acknowledged these menus as being created by a specific character in-universe, then that's pretty damn strong evidence that the menus themselves are diegetic in my opinion. Which leads me into the next important bit related to this. Unused may in fact not just add to the menus and executable being diegetic, but I want you to think about this. Unused is a script left in the files intentionally with lines of dialogue from a character we haven't met yet that's only been maybe referenced once ever in the game so far. And that reference is likely something you wouldn't even notice as being actually important unless you already knew about the unused script to begin with. Otherwise, the only way that you'd even know about it is by going into the
I got an Italian hoagie. Ooh, I'm sorry, from Lunchbox.
I need to eat lunch right now. I'll be back. Don't worry. In fact, you know what? I'm just gonna end this part here. I'm sorry that I did not actually get to the intermission, but I will get to the intermission in the next part. Yeah, goodbye.